Hi, I'm Michael. Today we're going to look at the dual 5.5 option on the Phrozen Transform 3D resin printer. In case you don't know, this is an option that allows you to print at a higher resolution, but also on two build plates at the same time. So instead of having one large build plate, this option gives you two smaller build plates. And the trade-off is that they have a higher pixel pitch, so you can print at a higher resolution. I'm going to go over the initial installation and then we'll see how quickly the changeover can happen. So one of the sales points on the Phrozen Transform printer was that it was modular or multi-purpose. I'm pretty sure that's why they called it the Transform, because like a transformer, there's more than meets the eye. Okay, that was stupid. The two big things about the Transform were the large print volume and the fact that you can swap out the LCD panels. Here are the specs on the default panel. This build volume was what drew me to the printer, and with this plate you can print at 76 microns. That means the voxel is 0.076 millimeters in the X and Y axis, and on the Z axis it depends on what resolution you print at. I usually print at 50 microns. But they also had the option of replacing that panel with two 5.5 inch panels, and here are the specs for those. And you still get that 40 centimeter or 15.75 inch Z axis height. And these panels have a higher pixel density, so the XY resolution is 47 microns. That's 1.6 times the resolution. I know that seems backwards, but smaller is better in this case. So that voxel is 1.6 times smaller. But also with this option, you don't just have one panel, but two panels side by side. That's why it's called the dual 5.5. And while you do have to print the same thing on both sides, you could print in two different colors since there are two vats. According to the Kickstarter campaign, we were going to be able to make the swap in 30 seconds. Pull out the 13.3 inch screen and put in the dual 5.5s. See, it's shown right here in the animated GIF. Then after the printer was released, Phrozen put out a video of how to make the swap, and that did cause some grumbling because the Phrozen video is about 2 minutes and 40 seconds long, and it's sped up with fast music playing over it. Plus, they cut a few steps out of the video. So it did seem to me like the main goal of the video wasn't to teach us how to make the swap. They were trying to make it seem like the process doesn't take very long. I wish they had just shown it in real time and had a voiceover to explain what was going on, because I had to play the video over and over to try and figure out some of the steps. A few people were upset. I, for one, wasn't too much because the video shows the initial installation, which will take longer because it includes some delicate setup steps that aren't required on future swaps. And also, 3D printing just isn't a speed game. It usually takes hours and hours to print. It takes time to clean up parts. It takes time to clean up the printer and put away the resin. Not much about this hobby is done at high speed. So if it takes a couple minutes to make the swap instead of 30 seconds, that's totally fine with me. But hang on, because I'm going to show you how long it really takes to make the swap. Up until now, I've just been using the larger build plate, but then I had this dog tag project come up. I have another video coming shortly that's all about these dog tags, so keep an eye out for that. Also, if you haven't done it yet, please subscribe and click the bell icon. I have some interesting projects coming, and you don't want to miss anything. Okay, I needed to print 150 of these dog tags, and I wanted to avoid as much post-processing as possible. So I wanted to print directly on the build plate, but the 13.3 inch build plate has these holes in it to help with suction. And when you print right on the build plate, it leaves these little dots on the bottom of the print. So that wasn't going to work for this project. The 5.5 inch plates are flat and don't have the holes, so that will work better. I also thought that this project would benefit from the higher resolution of the 5.5 inch screens. Now this surprised me. The 5.5 inch build plates are much smaller than I expected them to be. I imagine they'd be more like half the size, but they feel really small, and I guess I'm spoiled by the larger build plate. Let's see, mathematically, the print area on the 13.3, it's 481.8 centimeters square. And on the 5.5s are 81.6 centimeters square. So yeah, that's 0.16% of the size. You can fit almost 6 of the smaller plates on the larger one. But on the positive side, the smaller vats mean that you use less resin. When putting resin in the larger vat, I often will put about 3/4 of a liter in there, but for the 5.5s, a half a liter is more than enough for both vats. Also, if you're printing something tall though, you will have to refill more often. Okay, so let's get to it. So how long did it take me to do the initial install? Well, it took over an hour. Probably somewhere between an hour and a half to 2 hours. And that doesn't count the time I spent unboxing and getting everything ready, or the troubleshooting of getting the software installed or getting it set up in Chitubox to print correctly. To be fair, I was probably being overly careful. I was also filming, so that made it take a little longer. But still, I would say to plan for at least an hour to do the initial install. Here is the Dual 5.5 panel. I noticed this. It looks like something inside of them has burst. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it looks like there's loose liquid in there. So I was worried that they had broken in transit. I expected them not to work when I got it hooked up, but they worked fine. And once everything was set up right, the prints came out really good. The first step is to remove this front panel by unscrewing the 4 screws on the front and 2 on each side. The panel holds the front LCD interface screen and the side fans. This will still be attached by some wires, so just be careful not to pull too hard on any of those cables. This step of pulling off the front panel isn't shown on Phrozen's video. Next, remove the 4 screws holding down the LCD panel. When you lift the panel out, you have to lift the back part up first so that you can navigate the electronics out of the hole. I removed the cables as I was lifting it out. Next time I'll do it before lifting it out. There were a lot more drips of resin inside the machine than I expected, mostly under the edge of the LCD panel, so you might want to wear gloves when doing the swap. I cleaned up the drips with Clorox wipes. If I was swapping out an already set up Dual 5.5, it would just be reversing those 2 steps, plus of course you have to swap out the build plate and the memory stick. But since this is the first time I'm doing it, we need to do an initial step and assemble it. That entails installing the LCD driver board and plugging in the data cables, and this is where it gets a little tricky. The first issue is that there are 2 different kinds of screws, but because the Phrozen video is sped up and they never do a close-up, it's almost impossible to tell from their video which screws go where. After watching their video about 10 times, I decided the angled one is the one they used to screw the mount onto the bottom of the LCD panel. Then the standoff bolts go on, and then the LCD driver board screws onto that using the cap-headed screws. Next, you have to install the video splitter, which takes the data and sends it to both LCD panels. And this is a little delicate. It's an edge connector cable. The blue side goes away from the board. You insert it and push the clamp down. When installed properly, it should be straight, not angled at all, and it should be snug. But I wouldn't pull on it too hard, it is delicate. This board gets taped inside the mounting bracket. Next, we're going to attach the LCD edge connectors to the splitter. These were taped to the underside of the LCD. When I removed the tape, it left a little residue on the panel, so I wish they hadn't taped it to that surface, but it did clean up okay. Connecting these was a challenge. It's a tight area, there's not a lot of room in there to work, and it was really difficult to get them in there correctly, especially without perfect eyesight, so I was worried that I'd mess this part up. Now we can put the panel in. Just like when taking the panel out, you sort of have to angle it in and navigate the driver board around and under the front edge. Then plug in the power and the HDMI cable. It does come with this little adapter that you have to use. Then screw it all back together. But I did learn a lesson here not to screw it all back together before booting it up to make sure it all works. I didn't have the HDMI plugged in tight enough, so at first I got an LCD error message. We also have to swap out the build plate and put the new VATs on, but that's all super easy. The way Phrozen handles the 2 different build sizes in the firmware is that you just have completely different software installs on 2 different memory sticks. The last step on the initial setup is flashing that Dual 5.5 image onto a memory stick, but that's a problem if you only have Macs. So I'm going to show you how to do that in another video. The link will be in the description. I will also mention that you do have to set up Chitubox differently for the 5.5s, and it took me a few tries to get that dialed in. Here are my settings for the 5.5 inch panels on Chitubox. Okay, so it worked. I printed the dog tags and they came out great. and I'll go over that project in the next video. How long will it take to swap back? Let's time it and see. I'm going to try doing this from memory with no instructions. Okay, to swap it back, we have to swap the memory stick and put the 13.3-inch firmware back in. Then we have to swap out the build plate, and you know about how long those things take. Next, it's just unscrewing the 12 screws, pull the panel off, unplug the power and HDMI from the driver board, pull out the dual 5.5-inch plate, and put the 13.3-inch plate in. Plug in the power and the HDMI. There are 2 HDMI ports on that driver board. It goes in the bottom one, which is about in the center of the board. And then screw it all back together. But first, I learned that lesson already, power on the printer and do an LCD test. And up to this point, I'm at about 5 minutes. But then it took me another 90 minutes before I had it working and could see the test image on the LCD panel. I'll get to that in a minute, but first, I'll fast forward past all of that. After it was working, it took about 3 minutes to screw it all back together. So if nothing goes wrong, the swap is probably an 8 to 10 minute affair. Okay, let's back up. What happened? I'm sorry this shot is out of focus, but there's a little edge connector that goes between the driver board and the LCD, and that popped off, either when putting it back in or when trying to plug in the HDMI or when getting it out of storage. The problem is that where it plugs into the LCD panel isn't accessible. So I had to remove the electrical tape, lift the panel off to get to it, plug it in, and then seal it back up with electrical tape, which I had to go buy because for some reason I couldn't find mine. Luckily, after all that, the LCD test worked. So what did I think of the dual 5.5-inch option? Well, the quality is really good. I only printed out the dog tags, but they came out nice. And it's nice to be able to double up on the printing. I was able to fit 24 of the dog tags on the build plate, so that meant I could print 48 of them every 4 hours. I think if you're printing minis and you want to be able to automatically print doubles, this might be a good option. Nowhere else are you going to find a printer that uses the 5.5-inch LCD panel, but also has the 15.75-inch tall build height. But I do have some issues. What do you do with the panel you're not using? I need to find a tub or something I can store the panel in, something to keep dust and bugs out, and something that can house whichever panel I'm not using at the moment. Second is that I feel like every time I swap it out, I'm risking damaging something. I'm comfortable swapping out parts like this, but some people might not be. It's not like changing a printer cartridge, so you have to consider that. Then there's the cost. I think if I was going to do it again, I would probably just opt for getting a second printer instead of getting this option. But like I said, I don't know of another printer that has this build height. This video has been more about the installation process than the output. My next video will be about the dog tags. I'll show all the steps of how I designed and made them. And I'll be using the monocure pigments in that video also. So remember to subscribe so you won't miss any of that. Thanks for watching.